Well, thank you very much, and thanks for your hospitality and having such a great turnout. I have covered the White House since 1986. This is the 5th president I've covered. So when I talk about the range of the presidents from the beginning, I haven't covered all of them, but I've covered 5 of them. And I want to particularly thank Skip and Carolyn and Bob and Janice and some of the people I knew from the Clinton era in Washington. And it's great that, that they were able to be here tonight, and so I'm really grateful for that. People ask me, well, why did you write this particular book? Well, as a White House correspondent, you're always looking for different ways to see the presidents as they really are. The last book I wrote was about presidents and their homes and retreats and hideaways, so their natural habitats, what we learn about them by studying what they do when they're away from the White House. I wrote about Air Force One, another way to look at the presidents who spend so much time on the plane, and you can, again, see them with their guard down as they really are. This was a particularly interesting project because it's filled with compelling characters and compelling stories about not only the presidents, but about the African Americans who've been integral to running the White House from the very beginning, from slavery times through Jim Crow, through the rise of African American advisors to presidents, both informal and formal, and of course the current times when we have our first African American president. This is a particularly interesting picture, don't you think? Because this is the portrait of George Washington that hangs in the White House, and boy, what a contrast, what a bracketing effect this is on our history. Going from Washington, who was the 8 of the first 12 of our presidents owned slaves and had slaves in the White House, including George Washington. Now we have our first African American president. What an amazing arc of history that's been. But to get back to why I wrote the book, of course, Obama's election was important because I wondered, you know, sometimes the simplest question is the most revealing, and that's, well, what was the history of African Americans before Obama? What can we learn from our American history from that? And also this notion of looking through a prism to see our presidents as they really were. And so seeing the presidents through the racial prism, through the sort of our original sin of slavery in the United States, through what was actually quite an appalling history of our presidents for many years. But then I found it an inspirational story more recently when African Americans rose to the top of government. It's interesting that, and we'll come back to this in a bit, Presidents Reagan and Bush the father and the son are often criticized for their civil rights records, but they did promote the 2 highest ranking African Americans in our history, Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But I wanted to just take you through a little bit about this history because I think it's insightful in many ways to look at this thread of our racial history through the presidents. In the beginning, Washington, as I said, was a slave owner. His home in Mount Vernon, at different times in his life, he had 100 slaves there. He brought them into the White House. This is a depiction of Washington at Mount Vernon. He used to inspect his plantation. He was, we today would call a micromanager. He was always dictating how the plantation should be run. And as I said, these early presidents, the southern plantation owners, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, various others, started out not having objections to slavery. Now, some of them changed. Washington changed as time went on, and by the time of the end of his presidency and the end of his life, he had put in his will that his slaves should be freed. But he never did anything about the institution while he was president, nor while he was alive regarding his own plantation. So it's really a fundamental contradiction of our values and our ideals that the founders had this tremendous, terrible blind spot for so long. But nevertheless, the contributions of African Americans to our history has been really profound in dealing with the presidency and the White House. African Americans actually helped to build the White House. This is actually a depiction of the building of the Capitol, which African Americans also were instrumental in constructing, both quarrying the rocks and the stone for the buildings and actually doing the construction. This is a sort of an early picture that sort of gives you a sense of what life might have been like for the slaves in the White House caring for children, seamstresses, butlers, valets, and this was actually a common series of occupations and things that the African Americans did in the White House. There's lots of stories, as I say, a lot of compelling characters along the way. Paul Jennings was actually a slave for Dolly Madison and James Madison. There's a lot of stories about how Dolly Madison saved this famous portrait of George Washington when the British, during the War of 1812, were marching on Washington. They ended up burning the White House. Well, actually, this is a fellow who had much more to do with it than Dolly Madison did. He was actually in the White House, and he and a couple of other staff members actually saved this famous portrait. Dolly Madison gets the credit from a lot of historians. But to illustrate also the interesting relationship between African Americans and our presidents and first ladies, even though the country was not living up to its ideals, as I said, for so long, African Americans had a tremendous commitment to the presidency and the presidents and the first ladies as sort of a duty and as sort of part of preserving our commitment to history. This gentleman here, after Madison died, Dolly Madison was still alive, and he was given the opportunity to buy his freedom. Madison had sold him to Daniel Webster, the famous orator from early in our country's history. And Webster said, well, I'll let you buy your freedom, but you have to pay me, I think it was $8 a month, until you pay off what I paid for you. Instead of doing that immediately, he actually took out of his own pocket money to help support Dolly Madison because she had gone bankrupt. So he had actually helped the First Lady, just out of the goodness of his heart, to have some kind of a survival income, even though it delayed his own freedom. So that, I think, is an interesting insight into this long-standing bond that presidents and African Americans have had. This is this grand-looking person here. Her name was Elizabeth Keckley. She was a seamstress for Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln. You don't hear a lot about these people, and I hope perhaps this book will bring them to more people's attention. But Elizabeth Keckley was a very important figure in the Lincoln administration. She was a confidant of both President Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln. They would tell her things that they wouldn't tell anybody else. For instance, Mary Todd would blast President Lincoln's cabinet members and his general. She just detested General Grant because she called him a butcher. He was sending too many soldiers into these terrible assaults. But she trusted Elizabeth Keckley to hear these stories and to give her some solace and to keep her counsel quiet so he wouldn't talk about it later. Elizabeth Keckley, as it happens, lost a son in a Civil War battle, and when the Lincolns lost their young 9-year-old son, Willie, this was another bond with the First Lady, and Elizabeth Keckley was the only person that Mary Todd Lincoln wanted to be with her when she mourned immediately after Willie Lincoln died. There's another person that was very important to Lincoln. We don't have a picture of him, but as I've done the research for the book, he's a figure that lots of historians would like to know more about. His name was William Slade. He was an African American, a former slave, who was the valet to President Lincoln. Lincoln trusted William Slade so much to give him counsel and advice on what would make a difference to everyday Americans in Lincoln's speeches. So he would run his speeches by William Slade, travel with him around the country, and he actually took William Slade with him to Gettysburg, and the night before the famous Gettysburg Address, he in effect read his speech to William Slade and asked him for his reaction, and he adjusted it accordingly. So it's interesting that it's the African American valet that Lincoln felt had more of a grounding in what everyday Americans wanted to hear from the president, rather than these advisors and these high-powered cabinet members that Lincoln had around him. Now, one other point about Lincoln. This is Sojourner Truth, who was a famous abolitionist, visited Lincoln, and he did not have qualms about having African Americans visit him and advise him. Didn't have them on his staff, but he did bring African Americans in for counsel. A lot of people have asked me since I began talking about the book, well, what impact did African Americans have on presidents? There's a lot of that, and there's a lot of that in the book. In Lincoln's case, Lincoln actually commuted from the White House to a place called the Soldiers' Home which was a home for convalescing Civil War soldiers that was 3 miles from the White House. It gave him a little more privacy. It was a little cooler than the White House, and he liked to go there just to get away from things. But during his commute, which he did, he lived at the Soldiers' Home for 25% of his presidency, essentially during the summers and the early fall. He would pass contraband camps, camps for freed and emancipated and escaped slaves. And he would visit them. And the stories of their lives and their escapes and the difficulties they had moved him profoundly. After a while, when he started doing this, the word would get out, the President Lincoln is coming. And so the folks at the contraband camps would get into their best clothes. Sometimes the men would wear Civil War uniforms from the gray and the blue, picked up from dead soldiers on battlefields, and line up and welcome President Lincoln. He'd sit on a raised platform, and the African Americans would sing spirituals and tunes from their religious services. Lincoln knew a lot of them, and he sang along, and he would weep openly at the emotional experience, and he really bonded with a lot of the African Americans in these groups. So it was thought that this sort of deepened his commitment to abolition as his presidency went on. There's a lot more to say about our intervening presidents, but we don't have time to do all that, including the setbacks under Andrew Johnson and some of those, we think of sort of the gray presidents in the last half of the 1800s. But let's pick up here with Theodore Roosevelt, one of our famous presidents, a Mount Rushmore president. Theodore Roosevelt, of course, was vice president when William McKinley was assassinated, and he became president in 1901. Roosevelt seemed to have a good heart about racial issues. He talked about how everybody should be treated equally under the law and in everyday life, and merit should be the guiding principle, and so on. In the initial part of his presidency, he had Booker T. Washington. This is a depiction of this incident, a famous educator in the South who was brought into the White House to have dinner with the president. Roosevelt thought, well, you know, I respect his opinion, I respect him as a person, I'm just going to have a moment for dinner and we'll talk. The word got out, and this had caused such a tremendous furor in the South. There was just awful things said about how this happened, and what it said about Roosevelt, and what it said about the state of race relations and the need to enforce this separation and so on. And he never had another African American for a social occasion again. He had African Americans as advisors for business meetings, but never on a social basis. And this is a pattern we've seen in our history. Presidents often, even if they have the right instincts about equality and race and progress, often back off from it in the face of political pressures and perceived problems with reaction against equality and civil rights. And Roosevelt, unfortunately, was one of these presidents. So a lot of our presidents talk a good game but don't deliver, and that's pretty much been the pattern for most of our presidents. I want to talk a little bit about also how the first ladies have had a tremendous impact on these issues. Eleanor Roosevelt was not only a private advocate of civil rights and equality, but a public advocate. You might have all be aware of this famous incident. This is Marian Anderson, the famous opera singer, who was very impressive to the Roosevelts when she performed at the White House, and so Eleanor wanted to see her at Constitutional Hall, but the Daughters of the American Revolution would not allow her to perform there because of her race. Eleanor came up with the idea of having the government allow her to use the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument grounds to give a performance. Franklin, her husband, went along with it, and this performance was given, and she was a tremendous success. And part of what Eleanor was trying to do, of course, was to expose the country to a wider understanding of entertainers and people in public life and African Americans, which she did with Marian Anderson. She's presenting Marian Anderson with an award here. But Eleanor had a lot of friends in the African American community, including Mary McLeod Bethune, who was a very, very close friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, a civil rights activist at the time, and a government official as well. And there are stories about Eleanor when Mary Bethune was approaching the White House. She would run out to meet her at the gate, give her a big hug and a big kiss, and bring her in personally to the White House. So she had no qualms about showing her her racial desire for harmony and her understanding of the need for America to get past its racial prejudices. Franklin, however, was not as eager to do this. It's that old problem we've had in our country of being afraid of the reaction, particularly of the southern states, that this would seem, if Franklin moved too quickly, it would cause a terrible reaction and might jeopardize the rest of his New Deal agenda. But privately, this is another one of these insights into the presidents, Franklin was quite close to a number of his African-American staff members on his household staff, even though he didn't want to seem too close in public. There's a very poignant story about Franklin Roosevelt. Of course, he had polio when he was about 39 years old, an irony because it's infantile paralysis, it's a young person's disease. His legs were paralyzed. He never wanted people to realize how vulnerable he was. But he was always afraid of fire throughout his life. He was afraid of being caught in a room by himself and being unable to escape. And then this was compounded during World War II, the fear of sabotage or enemy attack. He was terribly afraid. So in the White House, he would conduct what he called crawling exercises. He would get out of his bed in his room and he'd get on the floor, couldn't use his legs, so he'd pull himself with his arms to a window where the Secret Service in this exercise had put chutes so he could slide down the chute and escape from the White House. He didn't want anybody to know about this because he felt it made him look weak and vulnerable. The only person he trusted with this, to help him with this and to work on it with him, the crawling exercises, was an African-American valet named Irvin McDuffie. Very, very close to Franklin Roosevelt. So it's sort of that pattern that our presidents have been close to a lot of African Americans around them, but often didn't want it known publicly. And even while Eleanor was promoting civil rights and equality publicly, Franklin would not do it publicly, but had this very interesting close relationship with the African Americans around him. Now, a couple of other points about the presidents of that era. President Harry Truman, of course, made a tremendous stride in integrating the armed forces. This is one of the first integrated units when Truman integrated the armed forces. He was brought up in a segregated Missouri, didn't have any particular interest in racial issues for virtually his entire life, except after World War II, he felt, well, everybody who fought for the country ought to have an opportunity to get things right and to succeed in the society. When he heard that some of our African-American soldiers were beaten and thrown out of trucks in the South, he was offended personally. It was a very simple reaction. This just shouldn't be happening. So he decided that he would integrate the armed forces, and he was told Congress is never going to go along with this. It's that old problem of the South, you know, the problem of the Southern senators essentially blocking this sort of thing. So he just did it by executive order, and it was a tremendous stride in integrating the armed forces, and that's a lasting contribution, really one of the most lasting contributions that any of our presidents have made, and it was really Harry Truman who did it. Now, Eisenhower comes into office, and of course Eisenhower was a general. He was accustomed to having staff. This is Sergeant John Money, who was his military valet, who he brought with him into the White House. I show this because it's an interesting insight into Eisenhower. Eisenhower thought of himself as this fabulous barbecue cook. Well, it doesn't look like he's really doing much of the work here, does it? I mean, I think this is basically the way it was. It's Sergeant Money who's doing the work. But a couple of other quick stories. When Herbert Hoover was president, the White House staff understood that Hoover did not want to be seen or to see the household staff. He wanted it to be thought of as to think he's having some private time. So when they heard his footsteps, they would hide from him. They'd hide behind couches, they'd hide in closets, and often people tell the story that they'd open the door to a closet with a tray of glasses and dishes, and there'd be a guy in there with linens and another person in there with other dishes. They're all piling into the closet so the president doesn't see them. It sounds very sort of royal, doesn't it? You know, this imperious idea. Franklin Roosevelt wasn't wild about this, but he didn't really do much about it. When Truman came into office, he said to one of his staff members shortly after he took over, "Why are these people peering at me from behind these bushes? What's going on here?" So they said, "Well, this is the way presidents have wanted it. They don't want to see the staff." And Truman said, "Well, don't worry about it." When Eisenhower became president, just to come back to Eisenhower, it's interesting in the insight into the presidents. Eisenhower, by this time, the tradition, they coming back to it again. And so Eisenhower said to his staff, typical of President Eisenhower, doesn't anybody ever do any work around here? I never see anybody working. What does the staff do all day? And so they said, well, they're hiding from you, Mr. President. They think you want privacy. So he said, forget it. Have them just go about their business. And that pretty much ended the tradition of hiding from the president. Now, President Kennedy gets a tremendous amount of credit and adulation. He's often, there's just new surveys out. Americans list him as one of the top 3 presidents. It just goes on and on. But on the civil rights issues, even though many African Americans came to applaud and revere Kennedy, he really didn't do that much compared to Lyndon Johnson. He was very timid about civil rights issues, but it was that same problem. He felt that if he pushed on it, even though he felt that it might be the right thing to do, his overall agenda would be blocked by, guess who? The southern states. This is common again and again and again. But as time went on, Kennedy, being a military man, while Eisenhower was running the war, Kennedy's generation were fighting the war. And so he understood physical bravery, which he had demonstrated himself. One of the things that intensified his commitment to civil rights issues was the physical bravery of the protesters he saw in the early days of the civil rights movement, in the streets, being beaten, being jailed. And he really respected this. And so as time went on, he did take more of an interest in civil rights. He had the largest single group of African Americans that had ever been at the White House. In fact, by some counts, he had 800 African Americans to celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation. That was more in total that had ever been to the White House before. He did it in one evening. This is when he said he met with civil rights leaders on a separate occasion when they were planning the famous March on Washington. And he was very nervous about it. He thought, well, it'll look like the country's under siege. You know, you're going to get people mad at you. And he was very reluctant, but he was assured it would be a peaceful demonstration, which it was. And this actually then prompted him to take much more of an interest in civil rights issues, because he thought he could deal with the leaders of the civil rights movement, and they had common sense, and they would pursue things without, frankly, making things much more difficult for President Kennedy. Now, of course, he was assassinated, cutting his time short, so we really don't know how that would have worked out if he had been reelected and continued in office. But Lyndon Johnson became president, and he took Kennedy's mantle on civil rights far, far beyond what Kennedy ever did with it, probably farther than Kennedy ever dreamed of doing with it, and also his general program of the Great Society, of government activism in society and in the economy. This is we talked a little bit earlier about Johnson's relationship with Martin Luther King. And here he had Martin Luther King over to the White House. They talked together. I mean, here Johnson is listening, which he didn't often do, but he did listen in this case. But it was interesting because their partnership was based on the idea that Reverend King would work publicly, keeping pressure, demonstrations, protests, eloquent speeches, and so on, while Johnson would work the halls of Congress. He'd work the inside game. And this partnership was very effective. It really moved our country very far, and of course it led to the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, many other pieces of legislation. This is the signing of the act. See, Dr. King's behind Johnson. When Johnson signed this act, he said privately to his friends, "I've just cost the Democratic Party the South." And he was right, because white voters in the South never got past this. And so it was a politically brave thing to do. Now, of course, Johnson was calculating that he would get African-American votes in great numbers and liberal votes in the North and so on. And, of course, he was reelected overwhelmingly in 1964. But the Johnson and Dr. King did have a falling out over the Vietnam War, and as time went on, they were barely on speaking terms because of the Vietnam War, which Dr. King opposed. But again, so many other things I could say, but just to keep our talk going here. This is the famous picture of Sammy Davis hugging Richard Nixon. Those of you of a certain age might remember this when Sammy Davis had a falling out with the Kennedys and with the Democrats because he felt he was excluded from the White House by the Kennedys in particular because at the time he was married to a white woman and they didn't want to be associated with that. So he never forgave the Kennedys for this, even though he had campaigned for Kennedy. So then he endorsed Richard Nixon. In 1968, Nixon was elected, and this was one of the things that Sammy Davis never could really live down in the African-American community. Richard Nixon, the architect of the Southern strategy, very divisive and polarizing strategy, pitting whites against blacks and so on, but he just jumped up and hugged Nixon at a rally. Nixon doesn't look too comfortable in this situation, does he? Doesn't quite know what to do here. But the problem with Nixon is that even though he did some things that liberals liked and civil rights activists liked, no one could be sure Nixon was doing it for conviction or political reasons. So he was always thought of as remember his nickname was Tricky Dick. And this was part of his legacy, a quite negative one. That lasted much after his presidency. When Gerald Ford took office, I was at Gerald Ford's Library and Museum last week and gave a talk there. And Gerald Ford was another one of these presidents who did have good personal instincts. He was a decent guy. He wanted to treat people fairly. But he felt initially after he took office, after Nixon resigned over the Watergate scandal, he would reach out. So he met with the Congressional Black Caucus. He had a very positive meeting with the black leaders in Congress, and he reached out to a lot of African Americans in other spheres of life, and this is one of them. You know who those folks are? Well, the fellow in the middle is George Harrison of the Beatles, and that's Billy Preston. Looks a little different there than he does now, does he? But Ford did try to reach out, and privately he said, you know, I'm sorry for some of the things that Nixon did and some of his strategies. But in the end, and I found in handwritten notes from President Ford at his library, he wrote a note saying, I will never get any credit for anything I try to do on civil rights because I'll always be in the shadow of Richard Nixon. And of course, he lost the election for his own term to Jimmy Carter. Now, President Carter had actually a very positive history on racial issues in the sense that he was raised in the rural South in segregated Georgia, but he had a lot of positive, fair-minded people in his family. His grandfather owned a grocery store, was very fair to people of all races, and everybody who came in, he gave credit to African Americans and whites and so on. So there was a lot of hope for Carter that when he came into office, he would be a guy who understood the African American community because he had lived with African Americans. He played with them, with African Americans when he was a child and so on. But it didn't turn out that way because Carter turned out to be much more of a more, you know, to put it charitably, careful or timid about civil rights issues. And so he was a disappointment in many ways. He did appoint many African Americans to his administration, but really did not make a big mark there. Now, it was left, actually, it was interesting, even though President Reagan was widely criticized for being insensitive to civil rights and the poverty and so on, he's the guy who promoted the first African American to the uppermost regions of government. There had been African Americans in the cabinet and senior staff before, but Colin Powell was named National Security Advisor by President Reagan, one of the top 3 officials in the whole government. And I interviewed General Powell for my book, and he said that, yeah, he disagreed with a lot of things Reagan did, as he disagreed with things that Bush the father did and Bush the son, but he said that in the end, that merit mattered. And so he always wanted to be judged on the basis of his abilities and his ability to get the job done, and he felt that that's something that Reagan recognized and named him, as I say, National Security Advisor. By the way, this starts to intersect with my time of covering the White House because I started covering in '86, and this is just as Powell was rising through the government. So I actually know General Powell quite well. Now, when President Bush the father takes over, he names General Powell to the chairmanship of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's back in uniform, and of course he was instrumental in running the Persian Gulf War with General Schwarzkopf, who was the field commander, and became a very, very respected and popular figure throughout the United States. You might recall he was thought of running for president himself. I think he concluded two things, however. One is that he couldn't be nominated because of his stance on things like affirmative action and other issues by the Republican Party. And the second is his wife, Alma, sad as it is to say, felt that someone would kill him. She felt that he would be assassinated, so he never ran for president. Now, how would things have changed if he had run? Would he have been, I covered that campaign, and I happen to think he actually could have won the presidency, but he could not have won the Republican nomination. So he had that big obstacle to get through. So in any case, so General Powell continues his ascent through the government. I knew President Bush, actually the father, very well, and I do think he was a very fair-minded guy. He gave me an interview for the book, and he talked about how he tried not to think about race when he was president, even in cases where he now admits he should have. But he felt that was the thing to do, to try to be colorblind and to base his decisions on merit. But I'll leave you to decide how much he succeeded in doing that. Of course, President Clinton. We'll spend a little time on President Clinton, of course, since we're in his home grounds here. President Clinton had a lot of advisors and a lot of friends in the African-American community. This was Vernon Jordan, who there's no more powerful outside the government person in Washington than Vernon Jordan in those days in particular. Very close, not just an advisor, but a real friend, a real confidant. And that has been rare in our history, that our presidents have had African Americans as real friends and confidants. As I said earlier, some of the household staff were confidants, but friends, that's a different category. But President Clinton did have friends in the African American community. One thing that happened with President Clinton, another, as so many of our southern presidents raised in segregated Arkansas, the desegregation of the high school, Central High School, had a searing effect on President Clinton, and he felt that he never forgot this all his life, because he saw the clear physical bravery of the people who were trying to desegregate the school, the hatred he saw in the opponents, and he never forgot this. And so he was brought up with this notion of something had to be done about our civil rights situation and about our inequalities in the country. You might recall when he was president, Toni Morrison, the famous writer and poet, taught him our first black president. Well, now we really do have a black president, but he was given that title because of his simpatico with African American community. And what was particularly important in talking to people around President Clinton and others, and having known him through his presidency, was his really closeness to the African American church. I talked to many people, including Thurgood Marshall Jr., who advised President Clinton, the son of the Supreme Court Justice, that President Clinton took a special interest in the African American church throughout his life. When he would go to an African American church for a service, he didn't know just the chorus of the spiritual. He knew the whole song. He could sing the whole thing, and he'd boom it out, and he'd sing it. And he had a real grounding in this. This is another wonderful picture of President Clinton at an African American church, and I have attended services with him and as a reporter and so on. And he really did have a real understanding and wanted to have an understanding, which is also very important. He named a lot of African Americans to his cabinet and his government. He, you might recall, had the race initiative that he tried to implement. Really didn't get very far. But again, a case where his heart was in the right place, but just couldn't get the agreement, couldn't get the initiative done. That's the subject of a whole other book, by the way, the race initiative. But I wanted to get to Barack Obama for a moment. But in the meantime, this is until Barack Obama, these were the two highest-ranking African Americans we've ever had in government. Condoleezza Rice, who was George Herbert Walker Bush's Russia expert, and then became National Security Advisor for George W. Bush, and then Secretary of State, and of course General Powell, who we talked about. These were the two highest-ranking African Americans, and again, chosen basically on merit, which is the way they wanted it. This is General Powell when he was Secretary of State with President George W. Bush. And this is a wonderful picture of Condi Rice, so unique. Our classically trained pianist, she's performing with Yo-Yo Ma, and she sort of looks transported by the music. And how she found time to do all these things, I don't know. But another interesting dynamic here is that she was a very close friend of President Bush. This is Condi Rice at his ranch in Crawford, Texas, with Donald Rumsfeld and President Bush. She was, by President Bush's account and others around them, she was like a sister to President Bush, very, very close to President Bush and his wife, Laura. Went to Camp David with them, went to the ranch with them. She was single, so she didn't have family obligations, so she was very, very close to them, but also very important in the government. You recall that during Bush's first term, when Powell was Secretary of State, he was pretty much overcome by Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney in his desire to do things differently in foreign policy and his skepticism about this unilateral approach and preventive war and so on. By the second term, Condi Rice actually made more inroads in backing them off from that than General Powell did. Part of it was because of her close relationship with President Bush. As I say, very few people were as close to him while he was president as Condi Rice. Now, we come up to the present time. This is another version of the photograph that's on the cover of my book. Just a wonderful insight into this notion of how far we've come. This is when President Obama first took office. He had the living presidents come by for a group picture. And it's interesting, you could sort of look at the pictures, you could get a sense of the personalities of each one of them. One thing that jumps out at you is, why is President Carter standing off to himself there? I wasn't quite sure if they didn't want him to be close to them or he didn't want to be close to them. I don't know. But that's an interesting dynamic of its own. But this is another, I think, interesting dynamic. How has President Obama handled his presidency? Well, this is another iconic picture of President Obama at the Lincoln Memorial himself about the time of his inauguration, literally in Lincoln's shadow. He's very much had a very much admiration for Lincoln for many, many reasons. Lincoln, of course, the great emancipator, also dealing with crises from the moment he took office, which President Obama has had to do, both of them from Illinois. Neither of them expected to be elected president, so it came out of nowhere, and the notion of trying to take on the tough issues, which President Obama feels that he's trying to do, as Lincoln did. As we said earlier, President Obama, in my interview with him and on other occasions, has said, well, we're not in a post-racial society, but I am trying to run a race-neutral administration. Now, some people disagree with that, but nevertheless, I think he really is. And, but he does have a commitment to furthering African Americans in the public psyche, if you will. He put the Emancipation Proclamation in the Oval Office, which is him. This is when he unveiled it, the actual Emancipation Proclamation. You can see below it is a bust of Martin Luther King. On the other side of the room is a bust of Lincoln. So he's trying to, I think, demonstrate the importance of our racial progress in subtle ways. If you look at his policies, some people feel, well, why isn't there an African-American agenda per se with the first African-American president? And I have, when I interviewed him, I brought this up with him, and he said that he feels that his overall agenda is what the country needs, and it's what African Americans need: education, health care, and so on. So if he passes his overall agenda, this is really what's needed right now. He doesn't think that an African American agenda per se is what's needed. Now, of course, the other part of that, as his advisors say privately, is this concern about the electoral situation. If he looks like he's favoring one group over another, then he will suffer in the electoral college for it. Now, one other interesting part of this is that President Obama, when I interviewed him, talked about the the idea that he does not want to be thought of as the black president. He wants to be thought of as the president. And he said the first year or so, he was very flattered and moved by the idea that he was the first black president, but now he feels he needs to move beyond that so that the country doesn't define him that way. Now, it's interesting because he and his advisors bring up the Kennedy comparison, President Kennedy. They say in 1960, President Kennedy caused a lot of concern because he was Catholic. There was a lot of people who were afraid of having a Catholic in the White House. After he became president, you didn't hear much about it at all. And the problem was, well, not a problem, but the situation was that Kennedy had so many other things to deal with, and the country felt there's so many other things that are more important, so they didn't pay much attention to the fact that he was a Catholic. This is where Obama thinks he is now, that there's so many other things he has to deal with that people just see his policies and evaluate him on whether he's helping them or not. Now, in some cases, he's not doing very well in some ways. The unemployment rate is still very high. The economy's still got a lot of people in trouble. The notion, he's got 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've got this vast turmoil in the Middle East. Who knows how that's going to turn out? So one thing after another. But he told me that when he makes decisions, he almost never thinks about race. Now, I'll leave that to you to decide whether you should take that at face value, but that is what he said. But meanwhile, this notion of the subtle examples that President Obama has in the visuals of this White House, many, many African Americans constantly are surrounding President Obama. And what the Obamas are trying to do is to show that this is normal. This is normalcy. This is what we shouldn't even be worrying about any of these race issues anymore. Michelle, the First Lady, is part of this as well. If you look at the events, the social events and other things at the White House, there's a tremendous commitment to bringing African Americans in, really more than we've ever had. It's not really remarked on. I'm sure it will be at some point by the media, but Michelle is very committed to exposing the country to African Americans in many ways. Children, African American children from poor schools and poor areas in Washington are often at the White House, and as Michelle says, she wants the people to feel that every person is welcome at the White House, including African American young people who might have never thought they had the opportunity to go there. The other thing that's important to the Obamas is this idea of being a role model. President Obama has talked about this publicly, that his election shows people of every race and background that anybody can achieve in the country, and that he is, as the first African American president, a role model, and he takes that role seriously, and feels that that's one of the important parts of him being president. I couldn't resist showing you this picture. Who's that? Who's in that picture with Ken Walsh? I'm interviewing President Obama, and just I'll leave you with this. I promise to take some questions in the brief time we have left. What is he like in person? Well, I've interviewed him 4 times, 3 for the U.S. News where I work and once for the book. He is a very methodical guy, a very disciplined guy. When I went in to interview him, I went in, and the other 4 presidents I've covered, there would have been like 5 minutes of chit-chat. You know, how's your wife? What's your daughter doing? What's your son doing? It's just good staff work. I'm sure he has access to that too, as any other president would. But not with President Obama. He's a very no-nonsense, business-like guy. He said, "I've been thoroughly briefed. Let's have your questions." That was his the chit-chat. And but I was, glad for that, because I had a lot of ground to cover with him. He had thought everything out very carefully, very professorial in many ways, very obviously very smart, but also dissects things. You could see that he was a law professor at one time, and not a lot of emotion though. And that's something that I think you see some people who want to really like him wonder, is he really as emotional as he should be? Does he have an emotional commitment or passion about things? I must say that when I've interviewed him, I haven't seen much of that. As other presidents I have, but not with President Obama. Now, one thing that people liked about President Obama when he was running is that he was so steady and unemotional. Remember that famous incident where John McCain rushed back to Washington to do something about the economy when he came back and he didn't really know what he was supposed to be doing? President Obama was very steady, very careful, and people like that about him. And they like the idea that he's steady and unemotional in these crises. So I think on balance, this kind of character trait, personality trait is good, because that's what the country wants in a crisis manager. So he's very unflappable, and that's something that people like. The other thing I leave you with is where things go from here. President Obama does seem to be moving a little bit, or more than a little bit, to the center, but he's very nimble. He can be flexible. I think that he is now trying to show, generally and with issues of concern to African Americans, that he is willing to compromise. He is willing to get things done, even if it means not getting everything he wants done. He's not going to go on sort of suicide missions politically, and I think that's the way he's going to be throughout his 2012 campaign. A second term might look different. I think he might well come to an African American agenda in a second term when he's not faced with the prospect of re-election, but that's open to question. So anyway, with that, I'll be glad to take your questions and on anything you'd like to talk about.
All right. Great. Any questions? Any questions of Ken?
I have one. I think most people will appreciate this. The beer summit, the famous beer summit that involved the Harvard professor and the police officer. How do you think that impacted the presidency, and then what were the effects on President Obama from that?
Right,
Did he talk about that with you?
Right, yes. This is what they call the beer summit. You remember that President Obama had a news conference, and the last question, be careful of the last question. I have to worry about that too now, was his reaction to the arrest of Harvard professor Henry Louis Skip Gates in his own home. He came back from vacation. It was reported that somebody was roaming around or trying to get into his house. It was him, the owner of the house. A white policeman showed up. Professor Gates is black. He was there with an associate who was also black, and the policeman arrested him. And he said, "This is my house. I just don't have my key. I don't know where my key is." The cop wouldn't listen. So then there was an argument, and then he was arrested, and Gates was brought to jail. This caused a huge fuss because it was, he's a very prominent, respected person in our country. The cop apparently didn't know who he was. He had an ID from Harvard, which the cop ignored. Anyway, this became a big issue in Boston, but when President Obama was asked about it, it became a big issue nationally, because he said that from what he knew, the police, the Cambridge police, acted stupidly. He used the word stupid. So then this caused a huge fuss. I know people said, a lot of people in the mainstream media, commentators, particularly conservatives, said, well, his first reaction was to side with the black guy, which it was. But as he and others explained later, he had experience with racial profiling in his own life as a black man, and as a man who, he comes from, he has a white mother and a black father, but he's always identified himself as a black man because he said that's the way he was treated. And so the feeling was, well, why did he jump to conclusions? He really didn't know what was going on. That was, I believe, a Tuesday. By Friday, he came back into the briefing room and talked to us reporters, and he said, okay, I did jump the gun. I didn't have enough information. I've invited both of them to the White House for this beer summit. We'll just talk over beers and we'll get along. They did have the beer summit. They sat out in the Rose Garden. President Obama, Gates, Crowley, who's the name of the cop, and Vice President Biden, and they seemed to all get along. And since then, the two principals, the professor and the policeman, have actually met privately and had beers in a bar and actually seemed to get along pretty well. I just saw an interview with Professor Gates, who said that he considers Crowley a friend of his now. So there was actually an interesting dynamic that these two guys actually got over their differences. But I think you'll see President Obama be much more careful in how he reacts to these racial incidents from now on, because he felt like he was terribly burned by this, by the way he answered the question at the news conference and what happened after that. So that's the short
Question,
version.
Janice. No, we need it for the report.
Okay.
No, you're a diarist. We need it for the report.
Very interestingly, you said that President Obama said he didn't want a black agenda because he doesn't really want to think black, white when he I mean, he's a president,
Right.
and we want to think that when a president thinks, he gets up and he thinks about the problems, he's thinking about the whole country,
Right.
the whole world. But also, ironically, a few of us worked with President Clinton, and I don't think it can be argued that President Clinton probably had the most diverse,
Yeah.
not only White House, but government. And I think, I don't know whether you asked them, but I'm very interested in knowing how does President Obama compare himself in that realm, as far as President Clinton saying, I want
Yes.
a government that looks like America, that looks like everybody. He made a point of that.
Right, he did. Well, I think what's happening with Obama is he's doing that, but he doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want to call attention to this because he's afraid it's going to look like he's playing favorites. But if you look at the numbers, as I recall, President Clinton named like 15 or 16% of his appointees were African American. Obama's are about 18 or 19%. Not much higher, but higher. Now, maybe you've seen different numbers, but those are the numbers I've seen from the government. Yeah. We have an expert.
Now we're talking to the personnel guy. Now you've got,
Let me, Bob Edge. I was White House Personnel Director for Bill Clinton, so I can't be totally objective, but I have a few facts. First of all, I'm very proud of President Barack Obama and what he's done in your book. President Clinton had 6 cabinet secretaries. Now, Barack Obama has only been in office for 2 years now, but the fact is that President Clinton had the most diverse administration in the history of the United States of America to this date. I hope President Obama beats that record, but he had about 10 assistants to the president. Colin and Condi were assistants to the president.
Right.
They were the only 2 African Americans.
Right.
There were 10 African American assistants to the president in the White House, let alone deputy assistants and special assistants. More federal judges, more U.S. attorneys, more U.S. marshals, more ambassadors who were African American than any other president in the history of the United States of America
Right.
to date. Now, I hope President Obama, and I'm optimistic that he'll beat that record, but that is the record to date.
Right, right.
So to date, he does not have more African American, and that's not counting women, Hispanics.
Yeah, I think
gay
the
and
number
lesbian.
I was using is after 2 years, comparing
After 2
both
years.
after 2 years. I have no doubt that President Clinton had far greater numbers over 8 years. And as you say, we'll see if President Obama gets to that point. But anyway, but
Okay.
we can, I'd love to get your numbers.
I'll give you the numbers. Yeah, everybody from Arkansas should be very proud of President Clinton and his record. Oh, and incidentally, typically you equate diversity with a lack of quality and progress. But we had actually the most progressive 8 years by any standard or indicator that you can name, right? More diversity, more progress.
do you think, I don't think Bob is undecided on the issue. All right, Eddie Armstrong, your turn.
I agree with Mr. Nash that there was likely more diversity because the figurehead was white and all of the people that worked with him were of opposite race. So I don't think that would be a tough thing. But a lot of my peers throughout college and throughout several Arkansas communities have stressed the fact that they were fearful of quote unquote reverse racism by the foothills of President Obama being too openly encouraging as to embracing or hiring a predominant number of African Americans. I wanted to know if you all had the conversation as to whether or not he feared, like other white presidents feared, the loss of an election or the loss of term in office because of an outward progression or an outward movement of too many African Americans being hired too quickly to look like or appear to be reverse racism in our society.
Yeah, well, a couple of points on that. That's a very good question. And when I broached that with him, he didn't want to go into it because he said, I don't want to get into a political discussion. But I think from his advisors and strategists around him, I think there is a real concern, exactly what you said. He doesn't want to look like he's going to cause a backlash, especially as he approaches the 2012 reelection. It's interesting because I see on a lot of TV shows these talking heads talk about how President Obama has this tremendous problem with white voters because he he's black. Well, Democratic nominees almost never win a majority of the white vote, white or black. I mean, if you look at Gore and Kerry, and I don't think Clinton won a majority of the white vote nationally either. I think Lyndon Johnson was the last president to win a majority of the last vote. So it's a Democratic nominee problem. But Obama is a very smart politician, and he understands all these things. So, and that's why you see some of the Republicans now thinking, well, gee, we thought this guy would be a lot easier to beat, but he's going to be pretty tough. You know, they're starting to worry now that this, especially if you look at the Republican field, you know, frankly, it looks a lot different when you see who might actually run against him. But anyway, to your point, yeah, I think he's very conscious of this. He doesn't want to talk about himself, the idea of encouraging people to think that he's playing favorites, but his people around him will talk about that openly, but privately. And it is on their minds a lot.
Todd, we got a question, then we'll have time for one more. Ms. Abrams, I'm going to let you ask the last question, okay? He's fearful for the last question. He ought to be if you ask it. Todd, your turn.
Real quick, what do you think with the changing role of the media, the diversification of different media sources, and the lack of, or the decrease of reliable sources these days, how do you think that's affected the presidency?
Right.
And how the presidency is perceived?
That's a subject that we think about in the White House press corps, and I think about a lot. I wrote a book about this years ago called Feeding the Beast. We are the beast in the media. But there's been incredible change. If you just take the time, I've covered the White House from '86 to the present. You know, in the beginning, we had basically 3 broadcast networks. CNN was a new thing. They couldn't even get a seat in the briefing room initially because they were thought to be sort of a fad. Now you've got 24-hour cable, you've got the dynamic of the bloggers, which is very, very important, the talk radio, in addition to the mainstream media, and you have this whole world out there that we're still trying to sort out. And the White House is trying to sort out. I mean, the White House is dealing with the same problems we in the mainstream media are dealing with in the sense that how do the bloggers fit in? You know, how do you deal with Fox News? And they've been hot and cold on that. But it's a whole different media world. The print media, we've heard this predicted for many years, but the print media are in big trouble. And I work for print media. Now, by the way, U.S. News has tried to adjust as one of the 3 news magazines, but now we have a digital weekly that we put great stock in because that's how we now charge for content. You pay $20 a year to get a digital weekly in your email every Friday, and I write a column for that. We have the print magazine, which only comes out 8 times a year now, but we have a very live web presence. So everybody's trying to adjust. Again, this is a much longer discussion, but I think the idea of reliable information is the problem. The long stories that, as a journalist, I was most proud of throughout my career there's a very low interest in them anymore. Not only, frankly, from the public, but from the print media industry. It's very rare that news organizations will spend the money to have reporters do long, explanatory, or investigative stories because they're not thought of to be money makers. And so much of it now is how do you make money? How do you survive in this new media world? And we don't have the answer to that in the print media in particular, but also it's across all the spectrums. And one other quick point on this. Unfortunately for somebody like me, and my son is in journalism, so I have a particular interest in this, as to what his career will look like. Americans more and more seem to want their views reinforced. They don't want to learn anything new. That's why you have this incredible bifurcation, you know, Fox and MSNBC and the bloggers and talk radio. People in the middle, it seems to be a shrinking group. People they seem to want their views reinforced, liberal or conservative or whatever, and that puts the mainstream media in a tough position because you can make money by catering to people's partisan and ideological instincts. It's tougher to make money catering to the middle of the road. That's what we used to do all the time. It's very hard to do that now.
Question for you, Ms. Abrams. Wait for the mic. There's a microphone right there, Annie.
First, I want you to know that the city editor of the Washington Post was my little cousin that I raised and he left Little Rock because of 57. And he and Miss Graham, I got to know Catherine Graham, and his son, her son. I know journalists. I know they're in preparation. My question is that at the end of Black History Month, that I've had to speak many, many times over the years, I want to know about the man, the journalist. What motivated you beyond your journalistic,
Right.
capitalistic profit that you'll make off of the book?
Right.
What experiences did you have that made you be a person capable of interpreting
Okay.
their
Well,
intent?
that's a
and
great
their life?
question, and I have an answer that you might find of interest. I come from New York City originally. My family was very politically interested, and we had a lot of talks around the dinner table on politics and so on. So I had a sort of in my blood this interest in politics and government. Then that intersected with, I realized that I had some ability with language and so on. But I trace it back to my mother, and I've told this story publicly, and my mother loves me to tell the story, so I hope she sees this. When I was a boy in New York, what my mother would do to encourage what she saw as her son's ability with language and communication, every morning she would write a word from the dictionary on a piece of paper. She'd write the spelling, the etymology, the history, the pronunciation, and by the end of that day, I had to learn that word, everything she put on the refrigerator, or I wouldn't get dessert. And I'll tell you, it was a tremendous motivator. And she did that with all of her 5 sons. And so we all have, I think, a facility for language. So, but she was very encouraging in it, and you know, even though I'm the first in my family to go to college, and I come from a working class background, she was tremendously encouraging, and also in journalism. We were a family in New York. In those days, there were so many newspapers. We had 7 newspapers at home every day. And so that had to shape you as well as a young fellow. But so anyway, the short answer is, it's because of my mother. And that's the best reason of all.